This is your introduction to Module 4. And in Module 4, we're going to be looking at two short stories. The first short story is called The Cull, and it's a fairly recent short story. And there's really not a lot you need to know about it, but I will tell you what I think will be useful to you. The second is Voltaire's short story, Micromegas, and that one takes a lot of explanations. So I'm going to be spending quite a while explaining to you what you need to know before you can dive into that one. So let's start with The Cull. Basic theme of it, moderately disturbing, like a lot of science fiction. And so the basic theme of it is the idea that sometimes human beings might need to be culled, with the idea that some are useful and some are not, and that can be very disturbing. It's a core theme in a lot of xenofiction. Xenofiction sometimes focuses on how humans define themselves, how they define humanity, how they define their own values. And what we find, I think, through xenofiction is that often our definitions of who we are and what's important to us, they're just simply not logical. So often when we're looking at humans from the perspective of aliens, or especially machines, which is one of the things that's going on in The Cull, we find that they don't value us in the same way that we value ourselves. I can't tell you a whole lot about the author. He's a fairly new author, and maybe he's going to be a rising star. Who knows? But read it through, try to understand what's going on in the story. It's a little bit veiled. There are hidden things going on, and they're really not revealed until the very, very end of the story. So it is one of these kind of epiphany style stories where there is release of meaning at the very ending when you finally go, oh, I see what's going on. So that's The Cull. The second one is called Micromegas, and it's written by Voltaire. If you're not familiar with Voltaire, he was an author writing in the late 18th, early 19th century, and Voltaire was well known for his political activism, for being very clever, and for getting in a whole lot of trouble. So bear in mind that during the time he was writing, there were a lot of things that were going on that were affecting literature and affecting art in general. One of the most important ones was the discovery of America. And when I say the discovery of America, I don't just mean North America, because North America at that time was seen as being a vast plain with, it was fairly similar to Europe. What really excited people was the discovery of South America. And the reason they liked South America was it was seen as this huge impenetrable jungle populated by people who we had never seen before, who had belief systems and rituals and other things going on in their lives that we had never understood before. Animals, I mean, in a lot of ways, it was kind of like Avatar, except for a pre-film group. So they would look at what was going on in South America and imagine all the things that could happen and all the things that could be there. Other things that were going on at that time, aside from discovery of things on Earth, there were discoveries going on which moved outside of Earth and which looked into what was going on in the universe, what was going on in the solar system, and there were just tremendous scientific advancements being made, which helped scientists, but which stepped on a lot of people's toes who had pre-existing belief systems. So I'll talk about one because it's pretty important to understanding what was going on in Micromegas. And that was the original belief system that started with the idea that Earth is the center of the solar system and that all of the planets orbit around Earth. There were incredibly complex maps and diagrams of how the solar system had to work if you put Earth at the center, because they understood about the movement of the stars. They understood that the celestial bodies were out there. They had a fairly good understanding of how the universe worked. Problem was, they could not stretch their minds past the idea that the Earth had to be at the center. And so there were sub-theories about why things appeared to not go in complete circles around the Earth, but appeared to go off in different directions. And what happened was eventually Copernicus came along, and Copernicus had the idea that Earth revolves around the sun. And scientists were incredibly pleased with this model because they looked at it and it got rid of these sub-formulas and sub-models that they had to put in there that explained the movement of celestial bodies. But it caused a whole lot of trouble with religious thinking people. It also caused a whole lot of trouble with people who simply could not get past the idea that the Earth simply had to be at the center of the universe. So the one theory that came out at this time that I think is almost funny in how it comes out, but very interesting in terms of how it portrays how human beings think, and that was Tycho Brahe. And Tycho Brahe was a brilliant mathematician and a brilliant astronomer, and yet he could not wrap his mind around the idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe. So what Tycho Brahe decided was there is a heliocentric heliocentric solar system. There is a sun at the middle, and there are planets that orbit around it, and there are moons that orbit around those planets. All of that is there exactly as we envision it right now, with one exception. All of that huge mass of star and planets and everything, all of that orbited around the Earth, which was then at the center. So for Tycho Brahe, you had a heliocentric solar system orbiting around the Earth. And to make that work, again, he had to come up with formulas and abstractions and all kinds of concepts that allowed him to see that happening. But it was easier for him to make those formulas up than it was to envision the idea of the sun being at the center of the solar system instead of Earth being at the center of the solar system. What was going on scientifically often got the authors in trouble, because if they embraced the scientific principles and placed the scientific principles above the religious principles of the day, often they ran into trouble with the religious codes of the time. And Voltaire was no stranger to this. Voltaire wrote things which were sometimes overtly atheistic, sometimes just moderately atheistic. Whatever it was, Voltaire tended to write these things and not want to apologize for them. And he spent a good deal of time in prison. He spent a good deal of time in court trying to back up his theories and trying to back up his political stances. And he was really not very well liked by people in power at the time. He would not censor himself. If Voltaire saw something as being true, he would state it outright. What happened later in Voltaire's life, and really throughout his life, and some of the things he wrote, was he moved away from having to state things directly and openly, because that's what got him into so much trouble. What Voltaire ended up doing was writing a lot of satire and a lot of allegory, because when you write satire and allegory, a reader can look at it and they can say, I think I see who you're making fun of there, or I think I see who the butt of this joke is. But if they can't see it directly, if they can't say, you named this person, this is direct libel. If it's not libel, you can get away with it. And so this is what really became Voltaire's forte, was writing satire and writing allegory. I'm going to tell you a little bit about another author who was writing at the time of Voltaire, and that was Bernard Fontenelle. And Bernard Fontenelle came quite a bit before Voltaire. And Fontenelle wrote a piece in the late 1600s called The Plurality of Words. And this is a piece that argues that science implies that the world was not created for man, but as a response to predictable scientific principles which would have had to occur elsewhere in the universe. So what Fontenelle was saying was, if it happened on Earth, and we understand it as a response to physical stimuli, if we understand that you can have a sun and you can have a planet orbiting around that with climate and an atmosphere and all of these things, if it happened here, why couldn't it have happened other places as well? And for Fontenelle, this was a major breakthrough, and again, the kind of thing that a lot of people didn't want to hear, because it did take away the idea that Earth was the center of the universe, or that Earth was the most important place in the universe. So Fontenelle, really, all he could do, because of the science at the time, he could imagine face-to-face discussions between us and aliens, but Fontenelle couldn't imagine anything like radio transmissions, things that weren't part of technology at the time. And this is something you'll notice about Voltaire, is Voltaire really had limited access to the kinds of scientific models that we're using now with regard to how we manipulate things, how we create vehicles, how we create spaceships and airplanes. He had none of that. And so for Voltaire, he had to completely use his imagination to make any of the connections work. You kind of have to overlook that in it and say, well, it was written many, many hundreds of years ago, so it's really not that important to understand how his science works. It's just more important to understand that he is definitely doing xenofiction here. He is creating connections between us and aliens. So Voltaire, when he wrote about Fontenelle, who was the one who started this idea that if it happens on Earth, it has to happen in other places as well, he felt that Fontenelle was capable of rehashing other people's ideas in a pleasing form, but he felt that he wasn't a very original thinker. And he often felt that Fontenelle was not being political enough and was trying too hard to please the people in power. And the reason you need to know this is because Fontenelle is represented in this book, in this short story. He is the minister from Saturn in Micromegas. Other notable things that were going on that you should know about that are part of what Voltaire was doing in his novel, he also wrote Candide. And if you're not familiar with Candide, Candide is a novel following the movement of a young man through various places in Europe. And again, it uses a lot of satire and a lot of allegory. And another piece that was written at that time that Voltaire was familiar with and which was published before Micromegas came out was Gulliver's Travels. And I've referred to it in a couple of the other things that we've read in this class. Gulliver's Travels was about a man who traveled through unknown parts of the ocean, finding different islands. And on those islands were different kinds of people who are not just people, but on one island there were sentient horses. On one island there were gigantic people. On one island there were very small people. And again, Gulliver's Travels was one of the first pieces of xenofiction, looking at human beings and saying, how would we look if other people were to look at us? So I understand that Micromegas is very old, kind of dated, sometimes hard to understand, but I think if you want to understand what xenofiction is and how xenofiction fits in with science fiction in general, it's a good idea to go back to the very roots, and Micromegas is one of the earliest pieces of science fiction ever written.